All right. Hello. Welcome back. Today's question was about what grinds your gears. Just keeping in the subject or keeping on the topic of aggression. So similar to when I asked you earlier in the year what your pet peeves are, but it's always fun to talk about the things that annoy us and perhaps drive us to, if not outright aggression, at least thinking about aggression. So that is why I asked about that. All right, just getting the slideshow set up for the day. Let's see here. Okay. Looks like it's working on my end now. All right. Before we begin, just a heads up. I've noticed I've had some internet connectivity issues on my end as of late, and so if the stream should abruptly stop at some point, just hold tight, keep refreshing the page. I'll get it back up and running as soon as I can. So just want you to know, should that happen. It likely won't happen, but just contingency planning. All right, so today we're continuing with our talk about aggression. Quick overview of the day. So we're going to continue talking about what causes aggression. We'll talk about some situational triggers of aggression. Relative deprivation, I think we touched on before we left on Thursday. So today we're going to pick up with social learning as a situational trigger of aggression. And then we'll talk about some influences on aggression from various sources such as our media, our culture, some different physiological influences on aggression. And then lastly, with our remaining time, we'll talk about reducing aggression and how can we effectively or perhaps ineffectively reduce aggression. So just a few reminders before we get into things. Number one, first and foremost, as always, I have bi-weekly office hours, Monday and Wednesday from 3 to 4 p.m. The link is included there. Just click that link and you'll be connected. Another reminder, reflection paper number 4 is due on May 7th. This is your last reflection paper. Has the same exact requirements and guidelines as every other paper. You can write about whatever social psychological principles or theory that you want. For this last paper, though, I'll just give you a suggestion. And again, not a requirement, but just a suggestion. Take a social psych concept or theory that you haven't yet written a paper about and apply it specifically to the current situation that we're going through, right? So we're going through a really hectic time, at times a really bizarre time right now. And remember the origins of social psychology in the early 20th century. It was an attempt to scientifically understand and explain what was happening in the world at a time when the world didn't seem to make all that much sense. We can do the same thing with what's happening today. So just to give you a couple of examples to kind of get you to think about this, you could write about informational and normative influence and how they both affect people's thoughts and behaviors in certain contexts related to current events. So for example, maybe you've gone to the store recently wearing a mask on your face, wearing a facial covering, and when you get there you realize nobody else is wearing a mask, you're the only one walking around wearing a mask. Or maybe you had the opposite experience happen where you show up somewhere and you're the only one not wearing a mask or gloves or something. If that is something that happened to you, how does that make you feel? Do you feel weird in that instance, in that context? Why do you think that might be? How does that make you want to change your future behavior, if at all? Right? It's how do you relate it back to those concepts? Or how can health professionals use informational or normative influence to their advantage? In a public health context. Or what about how many times this month have you turned on the TV or opened up your inbox and gotten a message from a brand about these uncertain times, where they really try their hardest to demonstrate concern and empathy? So think about some of the concepts we've talked about related to persuasion and advertising that are being deployed here. Or on that same subject, you could talk about like the misinformation about the virus being shared on sites like Facebook and YouTube, and how that relates maybe to the elaboration likelihood model of persuasion. Again, these are just some suggestions. You could really write about whatever you want to write about, but I don't know, I thought it would be kind of interesting to really hone in on like what's going on right now and trying to see it through the lens of social psychology. So just some suggestions. Further reminders, exam number 3, the last exam, is going to be on the day that our final is scheduled, May 13th. Exam 3, even though it's at the same time as like the final, it's going to be non-cumulative, so it'll just be like the other exams you've taken. It'll cover everything from, I believe, April 17th, April 12th, I think April 12th, up through the last day of class, May 7th. Like exam 2, it'll be timed and it'll be posted on Canvas. You could take it any time that day that you want to. Please send me an email if you anticipate any issues with that, and I'm happy to be accommodating there if you need additional resources or something to take that exam. I'll also send out a study guide, or like a study outline rather, prior to the exam, as I did with the last exam. And yeah, so finally, for reminders, just your daily goal check-in. Marissa, how is LSAT studying going? Gretchen and Jake, have you meditated today, or do you plan on doing so this afternoon? Myself, I've admittedly fallen behind on my goal of reading more for pleasure, but I'm aiming to get back into it tonight. So getting right back up on that goal horse, as it were. All right, so with all that out of the way, let's get back into today's topic, which is aggression. So we've been talking a lot about aggression and violence. I first want to start today by taking an aside to share some good news with you about, or like regarding violence, which is that according to all available data we have, violence worldwide is actually decreasing. So this is a figure showing the estimated homicide rate per 100,000 people in various European countries, spanning back centuries all the way up to the modern day. And you can see that there is definitely a decrease going on over time. This is the homicide rate. Similarly, if you look at the US, the rate here is dropping as well, this figure right next to me. And that's in contrast with public perception polls, which is the figure to my further left. According to public perception polls, people seem to think, the majority of people seem to think that the country is getting more violent each year, which demonstrably is not the case. So the good news here is that even though it may not seem like it sometimes, you could argue that the world is the least violent now than it ever has been. So just something to keep in mind as we continue talking about aggression and violence, which can be fairly negative topics. So at least keep this good piece of information in mind. All right, so we left off last week talking about the causes of aggression. And this takes us back to something we've talked about weeks ago, which is social learning theory. Which the premise of social learning theory is that we learn in part from observing and imitating others. So one of the very first studies of social learning theory, which was done by Albert Bandura back in the early 1960s, concerned how aggression was learned in children. So Bandura believed that frustration alone would not make people behave aggressively, right? So if you recall, on Thursday we talked about the frustration-aggression hypothesis. When we have a desired goal of ours that is frustrated or blocked, that is what causes aggression. That's the whole idea behind that hypothesis. But Bandura thought that there was more to the story than just that. So he believed that only if aggressive behavior were salient in a person's mind would they act in that way in response to a frustrator. So as part of this experiment, one by one, he had both girls and boys between the ages of 3 and 6 come into a big room full of toys. Before they were able to play with any of those toys, they watched an adult model play with the toys first. So the kids would watch as this adult walked around the room and played with various toys. In one condition, some of the children watched as the adult played in a very violent way. So she began beating up on a Bobo doll, which, if you've never heard of a Bobo doll or seen one, it looks like this. It's a toy in the shape of a clown, and if you push it over, it springs back up automatically. So this adult model, she's beating up this Bobo doll in various ways, kicking it, punching it, holding it down, and so forth. But not all of the kids in the study saw the model act like that, though. So in the second condition, these kids instead watched the model behave non-aggressively as she played. She interacted with the Bobo doll, but she did so non-violently. After each child watched this model, they were led into a different room with even nicer toys in it, like really nice toys, some really great stuff that kids would be excited to play with. And they were allowed to play in that room for about a minute, at which point the experimenter stopped them and said something along the lines of, on second thought, I can't have you play with these toys. These toys are for other children. So just imagine you're a child taking part in this study. You've just been told that you can play with all these really awesome toys. So you pick one up, and just as you're really getting into playing with it, you're told, never mind, put that down. How would you likely feel as a kid in that study? Well, probably upset, maybe sad, maybe angry. Your goal of playing with this toy has been blocked. Your goal has been frustrated. Right? So you can see where this is kind of leading. So all these children were put into a frustrated state. Their goal was frustrated. Then they were led back into that first room with the less impressive toys, and they were told that they could instead play with those. All right, so here are some less cool toys for you to play with. You can play with these for a period of time, is what they were told. As you might imagine, kids in that first condition who saw the aggressive model playing in that room played in a very different way than kids in the second condition. So those who saw the non-aggressive model. Bandura filmed a lot of this study, all of the interactions that the kids had in that toy room. So I want to show you a brief clip of how children in the aggressive condition interacted with the Bobo doll. As you're watching this, you'll hear the voice of Bandura himself reporting some of his findings and his conclusions. So let me go to that clip. Last week we had some issues playing video. If we have issues this week, I'll stop the video and just kind of move on. I'll share the video link. But let's see if we can do this. Oops, just a second here. Some technical difficulties.
About to see is taken from an early experiment on learning of aggressive styles of behavior through modeling. Children watched a filmed adult perform novel aggressive acts toward a inflated doll, and the physical aggression was accompanied by novel hostile remarks. We later measured how much of this modeled aggression the children had learned just by watching. Now, the measurement of learning of aggression uses simulated targets rather than live ones. The model pummeled the doll with a mallet, flung it in the air, kicked it repeatedly. Threw it down and beat it. It was once widely believed that seeing others vent aggression would drain the viewer's aggressive drive. As you can see, exposure to aggressive modeling is hardly cathartic. Exposure to aggressive modeling increased attraction to guns, even though it was never modeled. Guns had less appeal to children who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling. The children also picked up the novel hostile language. The room contained varied play materials, and children could choose to play aggressively or non-aggressively. The children devised new ways of hitting the doll. Now, the object of interest was the novel aggressive acts, not punching the doll. And children in the control group who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling never exhibited the novel forms of aggression. And here's a creative embellishment. A doll becomes a weapon of assault.
All right. So that was again Bandura talking about some of his findings, and was played over some actual footage of the children, like participants of this study, and you could see like the various ways in which they behave very violently. And again, all of those clips were from kids who saw the violent adult model playing with the toys. Those in the control condition where the adult model was non-violent with the toys in that room, they did not engage in nearly as much aggressive play behavior. Right? So those in the non-violent condition didn't play aggressively. They didn't take their frustration out in a violent way, even though they were likely frustrated by being taken away from that really cool toy room. Some follow-up studies demonstrated additional findings here. So within the condition with the aggressive adult model, the children who were the most aggressive with the Bobo doll were those who strongly identified with the adult model, right? Who strongly identified with them, and also those who observed the model being rewarded for her aggression. So those are two factors that lead to an increase in social learning. Number one, if the subject identifies with the model of the behavior. And number two, if the model is seen being rewarded for their behavior, whatever it is, right? In this case, it was aggressive behavior, but this applies to a wide variety of learned behavior. So, yes, so aggressive behavior can be modeled for kids in many different ways. Children who are physically aggressive tend to have had parents who were physically punitive, for example. So this behavior could be learned through parent-child interactions, right? So by physically punitive, I'm talking about parents who discipline their child by modeling aggression through like screaming, slapping, beating. Oftentimes, parents who behave in that way themselves had parents who were physically punitive. That kind of behavior can escalate into abuse. Now, most children who are physically abused in childhood do not grow up to be abusive themselves later in life, but 30% do go on to abuse their own children. So there's this cycle of violence going on here. Violence begets violence. And social learning theory helps explain why that is. If a parent is physically abusive toward their child, they're modeling that behavior for them and implicitly teaching their child that problems in life can be solved by being abusive or through being violent, right? So that's how that cycle is perpetuated. Beyond the family, media and culture are other teachers of behavior. So let's first talk about media and aggression or violence. So there have been a number of correlational, longitudinal, and experimental studies that have demonstrated a causal link between violent media consumption and aggressive behavior. So to give you one example of the many studies done, Lyons and colleagues did a study with boys in which they had boys live together in cottages for a week, like as part of a small camp. The boys were all randomly assigned to one of 4 cottages, and every night the researchers would have the boys watch movies. In 2 of the cottages, the boys watched 5 nights of violent films. In the other 2 cottages, the boys watched non-violent films. And then the researchers would observe all of the boys' behavior as they interacted together. They wanted to see how frequently the boys would behave in aggressive or violent ways, such as slapping each other, kicking, hitting one another, and so forth. Now, as you might expect, those who watched the violent content were far more likely to engage in those sorts of aggressive acts than the boys who were not exposed to the violent media. Now, beyond individual studies such as that, there have been a number of meta-analyses that have also demonstrated a link between exposure to violent media and aggression. So these are just some results from a meta-analysis by Anderson and colleagues from 2003. So you can see there's a correlation of 0.19 between media violence and aggression, correlation of 0.17 between exposure to media violence in childhood and aggression later in life, correlation of 0.38 between exposure to violence in a lab setting and future aggressive behavior. Right? So these correlations, they are small, but they're nonetheless statistically significant. They do tell us something about this relationship, as small as they may be. Often, when people hear about this line of research, about how violent media is linked to aggression in individuals, there is a tendency to be a little skeptical of it. Like the line of thinking is, well, I consume violent media. I like a good Quentin Tarantino movie, or I'm a big fan of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or I really enjoy violent video games, but I don't consider myself to be a highly aggressive person, right? I'm not going to go out and start killing people just because I enjoy playing Call of Duty. The reality is that lots of people enjoy violent media. It's entertaining, frankly. The reality is that if 10 million people all regularly watch the same violent television show, the vast majority of them surely aren't going to be spurred to be overtly aggressive based on that. However, there are some people who are more predisposed to be aggressive than others. So people with aggressive or hostile personalities, as we talked about last week, or people who deal with intense, frequent, chronic stress. Exposing people like that or others to regular violent media makes it more likely that aggressive schemas are going to be primed, like at the forefront of their minds. Aggressive schemas for, we're talking about like behavioral scripts involving aggression or violence, and so on. And being in a hostile state, while simultaneously being primed with those aggressive schemas, makes it more likely that those people will behave in aggressive ways, right? Maybe not overtly violent ways, but aggressive ways. So how do we explain this link between violent media exposure and aggression? Well, consuming violent media makes aggressive scripts, aggressive behavioral scripts, more readily accessible in people's minds. So for people who are highly stressed, or for those who encounter potentially hostile situations, those sorts of people in those various hostile environments, they're more likely to act in accordance with those scripts and respond with aggressive actions, the actions that they have been primed with. Social learning theory and research may also provide an explanation here, as we saw with Bandura's Bobo doll study. People tend to imitate behaviors that they observe in others and also learn new behaviors from them. To give you an applied example here, think about the implications of all that for copycat criminals. So the school shooting at Columbine in 1999 was one of the nation's deadliest and most widely reported school shootings at that time. 13 people were killed, 24 others were injured as part of that attack. It was a national tragedy, and its effects spanned far beyond those who were injured in that attack. So there have been 74 known copycat cases, and in many of those cases, many of those crimes, shooters have said explicitly and openly that they were inspired by the Columbine shootings, that they viewed the shooters as martyrs or heroes. So the copycat killers strongly identified with those Columbine shooters, and they observed the original shooters being rewarded for their behavior. Now, how were they rewarded? Well, through widespread media attention. The two shooters became household names for a time. So the message to those copycat shooters was clear. If you commit a crime like this, you will be rewarded for it with fame and infamy. Which raises a question, which is it a good thing or a bad thing that we highly publicize things like mass shootings or mass murders, terrorist attacks in this way? And you could, take either side of the debate here. On one hand, doing so, like, televising these sorts of things and spending a lot of time covering them, it helps foster awareness of the issue at hand. It may encourage people to reach out to those who are affected or give them reason to take steps to proactively protect their own communities in different ways. On the other hand, you do risk giving the wrong kind of exposure to the perpetrators, right? So there's really no clear-cut answer here. Another downside of exposure to violent media of all sorts, both fictional and non-fictional, is that it tends to make people believe that violence is more common than it actually is in the real world. As we've talked about, or as I started today talking about, violence worldwide is at its lowest level than it ever has been in history. But people who consume lots of violent media tend to overestimate the prevalence of violence in the world. And that can be a potential issue because that may normalize the idea of committing violence to a certain extent. It may desensitize people to actual violent acts being committed in the world. So that's just a little bit of the research on the link between media and aggression. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. Or if you're watching this after the fact, send me an email. Culture is another way in which aggression can be encouraged or expressed. So when we've talked about culture in the past, we've talked about it in terms of differences between national cultures, right? So like, for example, we've talked a lot about like individualism, and like the US is a more individualistic society or individualistic national culture than Chinese society, right? So those are nation level cultures that we've been talking about. But subcultures within a nation can also differ from one another. So, for example, even though the northern and southern United States are part of the same nation, make up the same national culture, there are significant cultural differences between those two regions in terms of their norms and their values. So norms and values about aggressive behavior can differ among different subcultures. So let's talk about a scenario real quick and then relate it to what I'm talking about. Imagine you are walking along a hallway and there's some guy walking in the opposite direction coming towards you. And the hallway's kind of narrow, and as he's walking, he bumps into your shoulder kind of hard, kind of like brushes right past you. To add insult to injury, as he keeps walking forward, he glances over his shoulder at you, he kind of sneers, and he calls you an asshole. Keeps walking. How do you think you would feel in response to that? Would you laugh it off? Would you feel angry? Do you think you might confront that guy about that behavior? Beyond that, do you think that a victim to this, someone who was put in this scenario, would respond differently depending on where that person was raised or like what kind of culture that person came from? So what if that victim were a man from the northern United States? What if he were a person or a man from the southern United States? Might their reaction to that scenario differ depending on where they were raised? There have been various studies set up to look at exactly that kind of question. And research tends to suggest that there are differences in how people respond to this type of situation depending on their cultural background. And when I talk about responding to the situation, I'm not even talking about like a behavioral response, but also like an internal one, how they respond in terms of what they think or how they perceive the situation, how they physiologically respond, as we'll talk about. So to get into this, different cultures have different sets of values. The same goes for subcultures, like people from the North and people from the South in the United States. Those values are deeply embedded in society, and on the whole, they're extremely slow to change over time. Honor-based cultures, or cultures of honor, are ones in which honor is highly valued. So honor is a cultural value that relates to the importance of protecting one's reputation and social status. So in places that have a culture of honor, people are highly motivated to protect their status or their reputations. Especially men, because in honor cultures, there do tend to be fairly strict gender norms. So men are expected to be, very masculine, to uphold their and their family's honor and so forth. Respect plays a really big role in honor cultures for this reason. And above me, you can see this. These are some example items from a questionnaire designed to measure honor ideology, right? And you can see they're all kind of framed in terms of like what a real man does, or like a man has a right to, so on and so forth. So the thing about honor, or having a tough reputation, is that it is precarious. What I mean by that is a person has to constantly maintain their honor in other people's eyes. And if they lose their honor, it's very difficult to get it back. As a result, even minor issues like a stepped-on toe, or a spilled drink at a bar, or a stranger walking across their backyard can take on real significance as a threat that must be confronted in some way. And although ideas of honor are somewhat important in really any culture, there are some where it's a particularly important value, such as in the American South and in the American West. So why is that? Like, why is it that cultures of honor exist in the first place? Why do certain cultures really highly value this idea or this concept? How does having a tough reputation come to be so important in some cultures but not others? Now, the answer has to do with the historical environment in each of these areas. If you live in an area where the environment is kind of dangerous and authorities or law enforcement is seen as ineffective, like they can't help you when you really need it, these are the places in which cultures of honor tend to develop. So think about living in the American South or in like the Old West hundreds of years ago. There weren't a lot of police around, weren't a lot of law enforcement around. You needed to defend yourself and defend your own property, right? In many rural areas of the South and the West today, things still largely operate in that way or very similarly. But historically, in the northern United States, things were not really that way, at least not to that extent. The North industrialized more quickly than the South. People tended to live closer together. Law enforcement historically had a stronger presence in the North and could be relied on. That wasn't really the case in the South, though, or in the West. So if you live in a dangerous place where law enforcement is not seen as that effective, how is it that you can ensure that you, your family, and your property are going to be safe from outside threats? Well, one way to do that is by developing a tough reputation. If you're a tough person, others will see that and they'll be less likely to mess with you or mess with your family, mess with your property. And so there's a great importance placed on people's reputations because of this. You can think of having high honor or like a tough reputation as being like having a lot of social credit. And it's really important to have this kind of credit so that other people know not to mess with you. And that helps you avoid all kinds of like potentially, confrontational situations. So even though the South and the West are no longer the rugged frontiers that they once were, this set of values has nonetheless been passed down and persisted over time. Because again, values are incredibly long-lasting in that way. And so even today, you tend to see this strong importance placed on respect and maintaining honor in places like the American South compared to in the North. So to demonstrate how this difference in values might impact individuals' behavior, Cohen and colleagues set up a study similar to the scenario that I mentioned earlier, with the person walking down the narrow hallway. They're bumped into, they're called a swear word. So in this study, the researchers used white men from both northern and the southern United States as participants. So their participants were led down a narrow hallway by the experimenter. In one condition, these participants were bumped into by a Confederate who then swore at them. And before the participant could respond in any sort of way, the experimenter, continued to usher them down the hallway. So they really didn't have a chance to respond to this person who slighted them in that way. In another condition, the control condition, these participants were not bumped into. So a Confederate passed by them in the hallway, but there was no contact made. After that event, the participants were led into a room, and the experimenter took samples from them in order to analyze their levels of various hormones related to aggression. So let's take a look at this figure first. It's the percent change in cortisol levels among participants. Cortisol is a stress hormone. Within the control condition, which you can see like on the far left, in which participants were not bumped into, Northerners and Southerners had similar levels of cortisol in their system, right? They both had similarly low levels of cortisol in their system. Among people who were bumped into and insulted, though, right here, Southerners had significantly higher levels of cortisol than Northerners, which seems to suggest that they were experiencing heightened physiological arousal in response to the insult. Now, it was also found that Southerners in the insult condition, and we're talking about this figure, had far higher levels of testosterone in their system. As we talked about last class, testosterone is positively related to aggressive behavior. So it was almost as if, in response to being insulted, their bodies were cueing them up to behave in an aggressive way, kind of filling them with stress hormones and testosterone. Now, it should be noted, not every Southern participant responded in this way, nor did every Northern participant respond with lower levels of these hormones in comparison. But on average, there were significant differences between these two groups. So how do we go about explaining these findings then? Right? It's not that Southerners are just naturally more aggressive or more testosterone-packed than Northerners. That's not the case, as you can see from the control conditions in each of these different figures. But it is the case that our cultural upbringing instills into us different sets of values that lead us to interpret and respond to situations differently. So differently, in fact, that we can even see differences in physiological responses, like bodily responses to being exposed to these sorts of situations where honor is or is not threatened. Not only that, but later on, so like part 2 of this experiment, these same participants who were either in the experimental condition where they were bumped into or in the control condition where they were not bumped into, all participants after the fact were then sent down another narrow hallway where a different Confederate was walking the opposite way. And this new Confederate was no small guy. He was a 250-pound, 6'1" man. This is another potential situation in which the participant could be maybe bumped into and possibly insulted, right? Here, in this figure, you can see how much distance there was between the participant and this new Confederate before the participant decided to step aside, like give way. Southerners in the control condition, who were not previously insulted, tended to give this man a fairly wide berth. Like, they were polite about it. They were quick to step out of his way. In fact, they were more polite about it than the Northerners in this condition. However, Southerners in the insult condition were far more likely to get really close to walking right into this guy, as you can see from the figure. It's like they didn't want to give way to this guy because their honor had previously been challenged in that previous situation, and on some level they felt like they needed to restore it. So the thought might have been like, well, I already let one guy take advantage of me. I'm not going to look weak in front of another guy, right? And so they were less likely to step out of this guy's way, or they did it, much at a point where they were much closer to the guy compared to the Northern subjects in that same condition. It's like honor, again, it's precarious and it needs to be defended. That is the thought here. Now, something else worth noting, this study, as I mentioned, it was done with white men from both the North and the South America. White Southerners aren't the only ones who developed an honor culture, right? It's not specific to that particular region, that particular culture. Honor cultures tend to develop among any community that, again, lives in a place that is dangerous, like a hostile environment, and where law enforcement is seen as ineffective. So to give you another context where honor culture is prevalent, think about places where gang violence is a major issue. Gang members place a high emphasis on personal reputation and respect. Think about where gangs are most likely to form, in places where the environment is tough and law enforcement is seen as ineffective or untrustworthy. Again, honor culture in action. Having an honor-based social system is an effective way of protecting yourself from possible threats, because if you have a tough reputation, others know not to mess with you, not to try to cause you harm. And that means, or an implication of that, is that you may be more likely to respond to various situations with aggression. All right, so that's just one of the many ways in which culture impacts individuals' levels of aggression or aggressive behavior. Again, any questions, comments, feel free to post them below. There are also a variety of situational factors that can lead to increased aggression. So typically, incidents involving aggression often include some type of aversive or negative experience. For example, it turns out that when people are hurt physically or even emotionally, they tend to be more likely to lash out. They tend to be more likely to be aggressive in those situations. So think about how you felt or how you've interacted with people in the past immediately after doing something like stubbing your toe, or like when you're suffering from a really bad headache and someone comes up to talk to you. You're more likely to be hostile under those conditions. Another source of discomfort that can lead to an increased level of aggression is heat. There's a positive correlation between the temperature and aggressive behavior. So Kenrick and McFarlane did a study where they purposefully stalled a car at a green light at an intersection somewhere in Phoenix, Arizona sometimes it was like a really hot summer day. And if you've ever been to Phoenix before, you know it can get pretty hot there. What the experimenters found was that people were much more likely to honk their horns, right? People in cars behind this stalled car, they were much more likely to honk their horns, usually continuously and with a lot of aggression behind it, on hotter days compared to on cooler days. On cooler days, people in other vehicles, they tended to be noticeably more forgiving. And that's not the only way that aggression increases as the temperature goes up. So to give you a few more examples, there are more violent crimes committed during hotter times of the year. During hotter days or hotter years, there tend to be more homicides and assaults in major cities on average. There tend to be more riots on average. In baseball games, batters are significantly more likely to get hit by pitchers on days where the temperature is above 90 degrees. And that's not just due to reduced accuracy because of the heat. Pitchers are no more likely to have walks or wild pitches on really hot days. They're just more likely to bean people. Civil wars are more likely to break out during hotter months compared to colder months. These are just some of the various ways in which temperature and aggression are related. Many other examples that we could talk about here. So pain and discomfort can increase anger and aggressive behavior. But what else? Sometimes our pre-existing emotional state can impact how we react to unrelated future events. So remember when we talked about physiological arousal, right? That's this sort of state of being really keyed up, really alert, kind of on edge. Our physiological arousal states, alone and out of context, are often subjectively ambiguous. It's not exactly clear to us in the moment why we are feeling the way we are. As a result, people's emotions can be greatly influenced by their interpretation of the circumstances of their arousal. This may lead to something called misattribution of emotion or misattribution of arousal, which is when we think that our level of physiological arousal is caused by one thing, like something in our environment, when in reality, it was caused by something else that maybe we don't recognize in that moment. When that happens, we may end up feeling emotions that we typically would not feel in response to a certain stimulus. So I'll give you an example of this. Let's say that you drink a really big cup of coffee one day, and then you go watch some sporting event on TV. After a while, you're probably going to feel your heart rate and your alertness go up. And on some level, your brain is probably asking itself, like, why do I feel this way? What should I attribute this arousal I am feeling to? Now, in reality, you most likely feel that way because of the caffeine in the coffee you drank. Now, if you were to make this attribution, this would be correct. This would be a correct attribution of that arousal. But maybe you kind of misjudged, or maybe you didn't realize that the caffeine is what was making you more alert. Maybe you're more likely to misattribute your arousal to what is most salient to you. And in this moment, what is most salient to you is the game you're watching, right? So you might think like, man, this game is really intense. My heart is pumping. I feel really alert. I feel excited because of this game. This game must be really exciting, which would be a misattribution of that arousal that you're feeling, right? So what's happening here is that you feel highly physiologically aroused, and you may not recognize where that feeling is coming from in that instance. But you've got this game going on in front of you. That game is a salient cue that you can use, either consciously or unconsciously, to contextualize your aroused state. And so you interpret the feelings of your quickened heart rate and your increase in alertness to excitement because of the game. This process has also been referred to as excitation transfer, right? Arousal from one event can lead to emotional reactions, or perhaps an overreaction to a different event. It's like you're taking your excitement, your excitation, and kind of transferring it, essentially, to a different event. So a state of arousal can be interpreted in different ways depending on the context. Schachter and Singer demonstrated excitation transfer experimentally. So they gave participants, all their participants received an injection of epinephrine, which is also known as adrenaline. Adrenaline, when you're injected with it, it causes arousal in the sympathetic nervous system. But, so the researchers, they gave everyone this shot, but they only told half the participants what they were being shot up with. They only told half the participants, hey, you're getting a shot of adrenaline. It's going to cause an increase in your heart rate. It's going to cause your heart to beat more quickly. It's going to cause you to feel more alert, and so on. So only half the participants were told the true side effects of this drug they were receiving. The researchers misled the other half of participants and told them that the drug was just a memory-enhancing drug that would have no physiological side effects, right? So they were lying to that second group. After the shot, every participant individually was asked to wait for the drug to take effect in a waiting room. Now, inside this waiting room, there was one other person, some other guy sitting there. In actuality, he was a Confederate who was in on the study. He was instructed to act in one of two ways. So for half of the participants in either of these conditions, the Confederate acted really happy and euphoric, like really excited, really like brimming with positive emotion. For the other half of participants, the Confederate was instructed to act very angry about something. Now, the researchers put participants in the room with differently acting Confederates because they wanted to determine if they could alter the participants' emotions by varying the salience of a label for their aroused state, right? So all these people were highly aroused. Some of them had the salient cue of like a really happy person in front of them. Others had the salient cue of a really angry person in front of them. So the researchers wanted to see if they could get these participants to kind of misattribute their arousal to one of those two emotions. So after waiting with either the really happy or really angry Confederate, each person was later asked how they felt, right? So they took a little measure of like their own emotional state. Now, among the participants who were not told about the side effects of the drug, those who witnessed the happy Confederates reported being happy, whereas those who spent time with the angry Confederates reported being really angry themselves, right? So it did seem like that emotional state kind of rubbed off on them essentially. They attributed their arousal to the person in front of them, right? So those who were exposed to the really happy person, they in turn reported being really happy themselves. And same story for the really angry Confederate. Now, the other participants, those who were told to expect the symptoms of physiological arousal as a side effect of the shot, like those who knew that the only reason why they were feeling really keyed up is because they were shot with adrenaline, they were much less likely to experience these extreme emotions. This is because they already had a cognitive label for their arousal. They already knew why they were feeling the way that they were feeling because of that drug that they were injected in. Only participants without a ready cognitive label for the arousal attributed that arousal to some emotion. Equally important, the emotion that they attributed their arousal to was vastly different, either happiness or anger, depending on the salient cues provided by the Confederate. You don't even need to give someone like a straight shot of adrenaline to get them keyed up and to behave in this way. The same sort of effect can occur after intense exercise, for example. So exercise causes physiological arousal, makes people more alert, right? It makes your heart pump faster and so forth. Now, people tend to think that exercise helps reduce aggression, right? Like you exercise to blow off steam, provides a kind of release for aggression, purges you of those like negative feelings. That's the common view. However, there is some research that suggests the opposite may be true for this very reason that we're talking about, because of excitation transfer and misattribution of arousal. So Zillman did a study in which participants were told that they would be playing a game with an opponent who was actually a Confederate. Some participants were asked to first ride an exercise bike, while others performed a less vigorous activity. So some people were performing really strenuous activity, kind of, getting their levels of arousal up unintentionally. Others were not. Others were performing a less vigorous activity. 2 minutes later, 2 minutes into this, the Confederate insults the participant in some way. Then, about 6 minutes after the first activity, when participants who were still aroused by the exercise maybe were no longer aware of it, everyone was given an opportunity to deliver a punishment to the Confederate, so they could blast them with an air horn. Those participants who engaged in exercise and were insulted actually delivered more of the punishment than the other participants. So the excitation of exercise intensified their anger at the insulter and thus intensified their aggressive behavior. Right? So the idea here is that exercise, it may make you feel good, right? And it definitely leads to like positive improvements to like your mood, obviously to your body, but at least in the short term, it does not seem to decrease aggression. It doesn't make you less aggressive necessarily. All right, so we're talking about situations that cause aggression. What about reducing aggression? How do we go about reducing aggression in a person or in a population? As you might guess, some solutions are more effective than others. So first, let's talk about some less effective strategies of reducing aggression. Number one is this concept called catharsis. So this is the idea that engaging in aggressive behavior will reduce it overall. So like, to give you an extreme example of catharsis, if you've ever seen the movie The Purge, or movies with related concepts, where there's like one night out of the year where society can commit crime without worry of punishment. And the reason for that is so that they can vent all of their aggression out. That's the idea of catharsis. Less extreme examples would be blowing off steam through stuff like playing really physical sports, or like football or boxing, or playing violent video games, or watching violent movies, and so forth. Catharsis might make you feel good. It might feel really good to go to the gym after a long, frustrating day and take out all your aggression on a punching bag, right? Or play a really violent video game where you're taking out your frustration in a way that is not actually violent. That kind of thing, it definitely feels good. However, it does not seem to make people less aggressive. And the reason for that is because of what we were just talking about, because of excitation transfer, or potentially misattribution of arousal. Another ineffective strategy, engaging in acts of revenge. Like, you get annoyed at someone who you believe slighted you, and so you get them back by physically hurting them, or being verbally aggressive to them, or spreading gossip about them or something. Getting revenge, it might feel good, but it doesn't make people less aggressive. Right? So what people do when they act vengeful is they're essentially rewarding themselves for acting aggressively. It feels good to get revenge. Those good feelings are the reward. And when someone is rewarded for their behavior, it makes it more likely that they'll engage in that behavior again in the future. Right? So vengeance, while it may feel good to get vengeance, it really does nothing to reduce aggression. It can even make it worse in the future. Right? So if the goal of what you're trying to do is reducing aggression, these two strategies seem to not be very effective. So what about some more effective solutions? So this is, from, I believe that this slide came from the child psychology literature. So like punishing aggression in children, but this can also be extended to like the general population. So punishing aggression can be an effective way of reducing it in the future. But you have to be careful to punish it correctly to make it the most likely that it will be reduced in the future. Right? So in order to be effective, a punishment against aggression must be, number one, severe, but without modeling aggression. Right? So if you are modeling aggression through your punishment, you're essentially just like reinforcing the idea that you can solve a problem through being aggressive, which is not good, right? You want it to be severe enough to have some impact on the person or child being aggressive. Number two, it should be something that's delivered promptly, like before the aggressor benefits from or decides to change their behavior. So the punishment has to be immediately after you see an aggressive act occurring. Number three, it needs to be perceived as justified, right? They have to understand why they're being punished. If they see it as unfair, the punishment won't work. And then number four, it should be administered consistently. You really can't administer punishment inconsistently where you maybe punish some aggressive acts but don't feel like punishing others or whatever it is. Shouldn't do that. You should punish consistently. So again, these are just some general solutions at reducing aggression in an individual via punishment. Now, beyond that, how about some maybe like society level ways of reducing aggression? For one, like strengthening social connections can be really effective. So environments that are more cooperative, they tend to result in less overall aggression compared to ones that are more competitive. And research suggests that minimizing social rejection goes a really long way in reducing aggression in people. Another strategy would be enhancing and encouraging empathy, like teaching people to be more empathetic and encouraging that. We talked in the past about how having empathy can increase people's. Actually, we are yet to talk about this, but here's a little insight into next week. We will talk about how having empathy can increase people's pro-social behavior, like positive, good behavior. Increasing empathy or encouraging people to be empathetic can also help decrease people's levels of aggressive behavior. Now, empathy is not a fixed trait. It's something that you can seem to grow in people. Studies done on juvenile delinquents found that putting them through empathy training in which participants learn how to engage in things like perspective taking and other empathetic skills, that can reduce aggression in the future. Another strategy is improving people's emotional awareness, which this refers to like being aware of one's own emotional state and putting real thought into what it was that caused those emotions, right? So like, I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling keyed up. Why do I feel angry? Why do I feel keyed up? What should I accurately attribute these emotions to? Emotional awareness, that has been shown to decrease aggressive behavior. Another strategy, teaching people how to minimize their hostile attributions. So the hostile attribution bias, as we talked about last week, is a tendency to automatically assume that people are being hostile to you even when the situation is ambiguous. And you can train people, or at least like encourage them to stop thinking in that way. Trainings have been developed that help people reframe their ideas about other people's intentions in their behavior. And the fewer hostile attributions that people make, the less likely it is that they will be aggressive themselves. Yet another strategy would be improving people's sense of self-worth and significance. So people with high, stable self-esteem tend to be less aggressive than people with low or unstable self-esteem. Like one really big source of self-esteem is via stable, secure relationships with close others, whether they're with friends, family, mentors, or relationship partners. And then I think I forgot to mention it, but the very first point, increasing people's quality of life also seems to be one way of reducing aggression in a population, right? Because according to the frustration aggression hypothesis, when people's goals are frustrated, that makes them more likely to respond with aggressive behavior. And, there are definitely some big frustrators to many people's goals, such as income inequality or just being of a low SES, living in a bad environment, right? So improving these sorts of quality of life type issues might reduce the number of frustrators people have, getting in the way of them achieving their intended or desired goals, which could lead to reduced aggression. Obviously, that one may be a little easier said than done, but, I digress. So that is all I have to say about aggression. Just a quick reminder, office hours via WebEx every Monday and Wednesday from 3 to 4 p.m. Link is above. The password to get into that office hour session is also above. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you have any questions about anything I talked about today, please feel free to email me or show up to those virtual office hours. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. So take care.